This week on the Storycraft Society, we're going to be making some of these awesome Feywild trees. Let's get into it. Hello everyone, my name is Garmin. This of course is the Storycraft Society, and today I am not wearing a baseball tee, and that is because it is game day between Germany and France. Let's go. As of right now, they play at 3 o'clock my time. I don't know what's gonna happen, and either me, while you're watching this, is very sad or very happy. One or the other. But with that said, I also am running a Feywild campaign for my friends in Dungeons & Dragons, and so I really felt like my table was missing that Feywild pizzazz, and trees tend to be the thing that I feel like I'm missing. So I wanted to take a stab at what I think a Feywild tree might look like. And to me, that's giant mushrooms. Honestly, they're not that hard. I probably could have made this video a quick craft if I wanted, but nothing else to say, so let's just dive into it. All right, so step one is an easy one. It's actually very reminiscent of the Woodland Scenics trees video that I did a few months ago. If you want to check that out, I will go even more in depth into how to make these heavy chipboard bases. But basically all I did was pulled out my heavy chipboard and I cut them into squares. Then from there, I shaped them and then carved them so that they set flush with the table. I will apologize now because I intended to film this, but there was a little bit of camera malfunction, as it sometimes goes. And so the result is, go back and watch the Woodland Scenics trees video and I will explain in 100% detail how to get beautiful heavy chipboard bases like these. Moving on from there, it was time for step two. Now step two is where we start to actually shape the mushrooms. Now the first thing that I did was I grabbed my XPS foam. Now this is the heavy density stuff, not EPS foam, which is the white kind of bubbly stuff. And I just grabbed scrap pieces that I had, something that I wanted about the thickness of the stems. And then I took out my Sharpie and I started to draw out the general shape of what I wanted the stems to look like. You can be as creative as you want here. You can make them real wavy, you can make them real straight. But then once I had all of those marked up, then it was time to pull my X-Acto knife out and cut them out. Once you have them all cut out, then it's really easy. You're gonna take your X-Acto and again, kind of go over the edges and fine tune the shape. This is where you're making them look a little bit more natural and a little less square. And then after that, you're gonna pull out your sandpaper. Now I used two different types of sandpaper here. I used a low grit sandpaper and I used a really fine grit sandpaper, starting with the low grit so that I could really make some aggressive moves on the edges of these pieces of foam. And then I used the fine grit to fine tune it and smooth it all out. Once I had all of my bases done up and looking like mushroom stems, then it was time to just pull out my hot glue gun and glue them onto the heavy chipboard bases. So next it was time to make the caps. And when I was doing this, the process was very flowy and I wasn't really doing it in a way that I felt was super teachable. A lot of times when I'm working with a project like this, or honestly any project, there's just a huge amount of experimentation and figuring out what works and then moving on from that and trying to do the next one a little better. What I decided to do is in the moment kind of give you a rundown of how I was going about making the caps, and then you can see what the final result looks like. So let's jump back to me in the middle of working on these and see what I had to say. Take it away, past me.
Okay, so to make the caps, 1 second. Now, to make the caps, it's actually a 6-step process, and I tried to do this the best way that anyone could replicate what I was doing. Now, of course, I'm doing all different sizes, so the mushroom caps are gonna all be different size squares, but you'll get the general idea. So the first thing that I do is I cut out just a square of foam, generally about as thick as you want the cap to be tall. But the truth of the matter is with this, I end up shaving this down a lot. So I would go a little bigger than you think you have to. That way you can always cut away. Remember, you can always cut away, you can't add. The next thing that I do, I shave down to almost like a square in the middle. that's going to be the peak of the cap. The taller you want the peak of your cap, the more you have to go in when you do this. So this one actually might be a little tiny bit too thin. I might fix that when I go to actually make this one. Then the next thing that you do is cut the corners off here. So you've got your little square cap here, then you cut the corners off. After that, you go around and cut this into a circle. Now, this is gonna look janky as heck at this point. You can maybe even go in and shave off some of those edges like this if you want, but then the way that it goes from this to this is honestly just patience and sanding. I used 2 different sandpapers on this. I used a real high grit to get rid of all of these nasty sharp lines, and then I used a real fine grit sandpaper to get all of the smoothness that I wanted. So that's that. Now, the final thing that I do from here to here is one, I cut a hole in the bottom right about where the cap is. That's going to let this sit down into my piece to make my mushroom. And then the second thing that I did is I just went in and took an X-Acto knife and cut lines and then widened them with a pencil and then took and textured it like I was texturing wood with a plastic wire brush. The reason that I did it was inevitably when someone picks it up and just kind of looks under like that, I think it looks fine. The last thing that I'm actually gonna do for these, just for one little added touch of detail, is I'm not gonna overdo it, but I'm gonna come into certain areas, particularly areas where it's a little thin, and I'm gonna notch out little areas like this. That just gives it that little tiny bit of extra mushroom flavor. That little extra bit that'll push these over the top.
So now with the pieces all hot glued together and assembled and ready to go, it was time to move on to paint. So the first thing that we normally do in a project like this is hit it with a coat of Black Magic Craft base coat, which is a 50-50 mixture of black acrylic craft paint and matte Mod Podge. But I decided to go about this a little different. I really love the idea of Black Magic Craft base coat because it gives me a flat black coat to work up from. Not only that, but of course the Mod Podge gives the piece a lot of strength. But I thought, why couldn't I do that just with a different color? So then I came up with the idea to mix matte Mod Podge and Territorial Beige to basically make the Black Magic Craft base coat, but tan instead of black. I'm sure there's a ton of you out there that's like,
duh, Garmin, like, obviously.
Yeah, this was a revelation to me, and it worked really, really well. I really liked how I got a better base coat than just a flat black, and I didn't have to work up from all those dark colors. This is something that I'm probably gonna do a lot more often. With that said, once I had them all Mod Podged up, it was time to move on to painting. So I started with the stems, and the stems I went with 2 different colors. I went with a khaki first over the whole thing, and then I followed that up with an antique white over the whole thing. I really wanted this to have that very like Alice in Wonderland-y feeling, fairy tale-esque quality. So I wanted something that went to an almost white. That was then followed up by a cherry red. Now, surprisingly, I only did 1 coat of this because I liked a little bit of the brown coming up through. That made it feel very mushroomy to me, but I did 1 coat of cherry red over the tops of my mushrooms. The fun part was actually pulling the antique white out again and then dotting all over the tops of the mushrooms to give them that over-the-top fairy tale kind of feel. That's really, for me, where these pieces looked in life like they did in my head when I first started the project. Now, one thing that is actually really awesome to mention about doing a project like this is all of the different variations you can get just from trying to be creative. I ended up painting up 2 more. I painted up this kind of purple, maybe alien-y looking one, and then I painted up one that looks more like a realistic mushroom. And the thing that I will say about both of these is there's so much color variation. It's just up to your imagination what you decide to do with it. Sometimes when you mess around with this sort of thing, you're gonna get stuff that you really like. And some stuff you're gonna do, you're not gonna like. I'm not a huge fan of this purple one. I had an idea in my head and I thought, you know, purple contrasting with green, it'll give this really like fairy tale quality. And it ended up just looking kind of, for me. Kind of alien, kind of just poor paint job. But then also me being creative, I ended up with this realistic looking mushroom and I just love the heck out of this paint job. It really feels to me like a real, giant mushroom, which is very, very neat. Now for the bases, I'm gonna actually send you back to the Woodland Scenics tree video. I basically did them the same way. I did get a little bit more frisky with putting foliage and rocks and stuff on the bottoms of these, but the process is basically the same. I started with Soilworks, which is a product from Scale 75, and I actually didn't use the winter ground this time. I used the autumn ground, which is an awesome contrast to the winter ground that actually dries in a very glossy finish. And I figured that that was actually better for the mushrooms because the mushrooms would be growing in kind of damper, more rich soiled ground. And then I followed that up by just using my typical Woodland Scenics flock and white glue mixture, and the result came out like this. And honestly, I am so pleased with this project. It definitely went well past my expectations of what it was going to turn out as. I think this is just another hilarious example of me trying to prove to myself that I said last time I would do no more trees videos, and now I found a creative way to do another. But this is one that I'm just so pleased with the result of. I'm gonna use these all the time in my Feywild campaign, and I think it's gonna really enhance the scenes for my players, and nothing else makes me more happy. But with that said, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, definitely leave me a like down below. Leave me a comment and tell me what you think of these. What colors would be cool that I didn't use? This one is just kind of for me, but I'm sure there's a cool color pattern or something that I could have done different. I also could have painted some to look like Underdark, you know, more Underdark examples. So it's like maybe darker colors and more sinister looking. That'd be neat too. But share this video with a friend who you think would enjoy it, and if you're not subscribed to the channel, I would encourage you to do so. We make a lot of Dungeons & Dragons content, and I think you'll enjoy all of it. But with all that said, I've got nothing else to say in this video other than, let's go Germany, kick the crap out of France. We'll see you next week.